My daughter collapsed on my porch at 3 in the morning, barefoot, blue-lipped, her body shutting down after walking over 2 miles through a birch forest in a blizzard at 18 below zero. Her husband told the police she had simply wandered off during an anxiety episode. He used the word fragile. He said it with exactly the right amount of worry in his voice. I know. Because I spent 28 years with the FBI analyzing what human voices do when they lie. I said nothing at that hospital. I let him talk. I let him perform. Then I played the recording he never knew existed, the one made by his own microphones, hidden inside the walls of my daughter's home. I truly appreciate you being here with me right now. Before we continue, leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from. I read every single one. Also, please note this story may include some fictional elements added for reflection and storytelling. Any resemblance to real people or places could be coincidental, but the message behind it is worth hearing and thinking about. I have lived alone long enough to know the difference between the sounds a house makes at night and the sounds that mean something is wrong. The baseboard heater along the north wall ticks on every 35 minutes. A metallic pulse so familiar, I stopped registering it years ago. The birch trees along the property line creak when the wind comes off Lake Superior. A sound like old rope pulling against a dock. After 9 years in this house on the eastern edge of Marquette, Michigan, I knew every sound this place made. The way you know the breathing of someone you have loved for a long time, even after they are gone. So when the knocking started at 3 in the morning, I was already sitting up before I was fully awake. It was not the wind. It was not the pipes. It was a fist against wood. And the pattern was wrong, uneven, desperate. The kind of knocking where the hand behind it is no longer thinking about rhythm or courtesy, but is simply trying to make contact with something solid before the rest of the body gives out. I swung my legs off the bed and reached for the lamp. The clock read 3:02. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 18 below zero, and the snow that had been falling since late afternoon had thickened into the kind of blizzard that erases everything beyond the glass. I am 63 years old. I spent 28 years as a forensic audio analyst for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is a precise way of saying I was paid to listen to things other people could not hear. Voice prints. Ambient sound reconstruction. The particular frequency shifts that occur in the human voice when a person is lying or frightened or telling the truth for the first time. I learned early that the middle of the night only delivers 2 kinds of sounds at your door, the kind made by someone who is lost and the kind made by someone who is running. The knocking told me this was the second kind. I pulled on my boots without lacing them and crossed the hallway in the dark. My hand found the porch light switch from memory. I unlocked the deadbolt, turned the handle, and opened the door. The cold hit me first. Not cold the way a winter morning is cold, but cold as a physical wall that pressed against my face with the flat authority of something that intended to stay. Then I saw her. My daughter, Wren, was not standing. She was on her knees on the top step, her right hand still raised against the door frame, her left arm folded against her body in the way a person holds something that has been hurt. She was 30 years old and she had walked through a birch forest in the dark in a blizzard to get to my door, and it showed in every part of her. Her lips had gone the color of a deep bruise, a blue so dark it looked violet under the porch light. Her feet were bare against the frozen wood, and the skin had taken on the waxy, pale quality that I recognized from cold exposure training at Quantico more than 3 decades ago. Her hair was rigid with ice. She was wearing a thin silk blouse, pearl-colored, the kind of garment that belongs at a dinner party, not in a December blizzard in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. She had no coat. She had no shoes. She had nothing except herself, and whatever was left inside her that had been strong enough to carry her through 2 miles of frozen forest to this porch. Her eyes found mine. I had spent 28 years studying the way human beings communicate under extreme duress, listening for the micro-signals the voice produces when the conscious mind has been stripped to its most basic functions. I had heard those signals in hostage calls and in the final transmissions of officers in the field. I had never heard them in person from someone I loved until that moment. Wren did not speak. Her eyes held the particular blankness of a system that had spent everything it had just to arrive and had nothing left for the task of explaining why. I did not ask questions. I reached down, got my hands under her arms, and pulled her inside. The door closed, and the wind cut off, and what replaced it was a silence. So sudden it rang in my ears like a tone. I carried her to the couch nearest the baseboard heater. She weighed less than I expected, and that registered alongside everything else. I was cataloging, without meaning to, the way her body trembled in a pattern that was not shivering but something deeper. The way her breathing came in shallow intervals that told me her lungs were working harder than they should. The way she did not resist being moved, which meant either she trusted me completely or she had passed the point where resistance was possible. I reached for the wool blankets I keep on the armchair. The same blankets that have been there since the first winter. Margaret and I spent in this house, back when the cold was something we managed together rather than something I managed alone. I wrapped the first around her shoulders and the second around her feet, which were the color of candle wax and cold in a way that went deeper than surface. I knelt beside the couch and put my hand on her face. Her skin was so cold it did not feel like skin. It felt like something that had been left outside and forgotten. My daughter looked at me from underneath that blanket with empty, exhausted eyes, and I understood two things with the kind of clarity that arrives only when every non-essential thought has been burned away. The first was that whatever had brought her to my door tonight was not an accident, and was not a misunderstanding, and was not any of the words that would later be used to describe it. The second was that the silence filling this room, the silence she had been living inside for longer than I yet knew, was the loudest thing I had ever heard in 28 years of listening. The investigator and the father moved at the same time. I had spent most of my adult life keeping those two instincts separate, filing evidence in one part of my mind while the human reactions waited in another. That discipline held through 247 federal cases. It held through depositions that lasted 9 hours and recordings that made me set my headphones down and walk outside for air. It did not hold now. Both parts of me reached for my daughter at the same moment, and I stopped trying to decide which one was in charge. I grabbed my phone off the side table and called 911. While the line connected, I kept my hands working, checking the position of her head, making sure her airway was clear. Field first aid training. Quantico. 1996. The instructor had been a former Navy corpsman named Briggs, who had a particular way of saying the word hypothermia that made it sound like an enemy he had fought before and intended to fight again. Core temperature first. Get the trunk warm before the extremities. Do not apply direct heat. The body, when it has been pushed that far, needs to be led back rather than forced. The dispatcher answered, and I gave the address. I told them I had a woman, 30 years old, severe cold exposure after extended time outdoors in blizzard conditions. I asked for an ambulance, put the phone on speaker, set it on the coffee table, and kept working. I went to the kitchen and filled a mug with warm water from the tap. Not hot. 28 years of reviewing forensic medical records had taught me that warming someone too fast after extreme cold can send the system into shock. Warm and slow. I brought the mug back and wrapped her hands around it, keeping my own hands over hers until I felt her grip tighten slightly. That meant her body was still in the fight. The dispatcher asked questions and I answered without looking away from Wren. Breathing. Yes. Responsive. Partially. Frostbite. Checking now. I lifted the blanket from her feet. The skin was pale and waxy, the toes taking on the particular stillness of tissue that has stopped receiving adequate circulation. I covered them and tucked the blanket tighter. 14 minutes for the ambulance, the dispatcher said. I said understood, and kept my hands moving. It was when I was checking her hands for circulation that I found them. I have been in this work long enough to know what cold does to skin and what birch branches do when you push through them in the dark. I know those marks. Ragged, shallow, the pattern of someone fighting through dense forest cover at speed. Wren had some of those. Her palms were scraped raw, and her left forearm carried a long, shallow cut below the elbow, consistent with a branch strike. But there were other marks, older ones. On the inside of her wrists and along the backs of her upper arms, marks that had nothing to do with birch trees or frozen ground. They were faded at the edges in the way that meant they had not happened tonight. They had happened before tonight, more than once, with enough time in between for the skin to begin the long process of trying to forget. I looked at them the way I had looked at evidence for 3 decades. Without flinching. Without allowing what I was seeing to reach the part of me that would need to process it later. The marks were layered, different stages of healing. Some were the yellow-green of injuries approximately 2 weeks old. Others had faded further, 3 weeks, perhaps 4. The edges blurring into surrounding skin the way old ink fades on paper. It was an archaeology. Each layer a separate event, a separate night, a separate moment that had been bad enough to leave a record, and quiet enough afterward that the record had been left to heal in silence. I knew this pattern. I had seen it in case files and forensic reports that described damage to human tissue without acknowledging that the tissue belonged to someone who was afraid. I had built timelines from marks like these for attorneys who needed the truth organized in language a courtroom could follow. I had done it professionally, precisely, without personal investment. I had never done it on my daughter's skin. The baseboard heater clicked on. Outside, through the snow and the distance, I could hear the first thin wail of a siren working its way along the lakefront road. Wren was staring at the ceiling with those empty eyes, and I pulled the blanket tighter around her without saying a word about what I had seen. I thought about Margaret. Not the last year, not the hospital rooms, not the machines that monitored her breathing and frequencies I could identify by ear. I thought about her hands. The way she used to press her palm flat against my chest when I came home late from a case and say nothing. Just hold it there. Reading my heartbeat, the way I read voice prints, finding whatever she needed in the rhythm underneath. She had been gone 9 years. Pancreatic cancer. 56 years old. 27 years together in this house with these blankets and this heater that clicked on every 35 minutes whether anyone was listening or not. She would have known what to do right now. The difference between Margaret and me was that she understood people the way I understood sound. Instinctively, without needing to take them apart first. I took things apart. I analyzed frequencies and isolated waveforms. Margaret just listened. She heard what was underneath without the equipment. The siren was closer now, the pitch rising as the ambulance turned onto our road. I looked at the marks on Wren's arms one final time. I did not photograph them. I did not need to. 28 years had given me the kind of memory that files details automatically, storing them where they remain accessible long after the moment has passed. The marks were filed. The timeline was already assembling itself in the back of my mind, connecting what I was seeing tonight to what I had suspected since September, to what I had been building quietly in a fireproof safe in my bedroom closet for 5 months. The red and white lights swept across the living room walls. I stood and moved toward the door, and I understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent his career finding the beginnings of stories that other people thought had already ended, that what I was looking at on my daughter's skin was not the beginning. It was the middle. The beginning was somewhere else, buried under months of silence, and I was going to find it. She told me the story in pieces over the next hour, while the ambulance made its way through the blizzard and the paramedics worked around us with quiet efficiency. I sat beside her on the gurney, and I listened the way I had trained myself to listen over 28 years of pulling truth out of situations that did not want to give it up. Without interrupting, without reacting, just taking it in, filing it, letting the picture build itself one detail at a time. It was the hardest listening I have ever done. Harder than the hostage recordings. Harder than the surveillance tapes where you already know how the story ends before the last voice cuts out. Because this was not a case file. This was my daughter's voice coming through the wreckage of whatever she had been living inside. and every word she said cost her something I could hear but could not measure. The evening had started as a party. Her husband, a corporate attorney named Colton Ashford, had been planning the event for weeks. He was a named partner at a firm downtown, and the gathering was for senior associates, a few judges from the county circuit, the kind of room Colton assembled with the careful attention of a man who understood that professional reputation was a structure that required constant maintenance. 25 or 30 guests were expected. Wren had spent the afternoon preparing the house. She had not been consulted about the menu or the guest list, but she had arranged the glasses and set out the appetizers and made certain every surface met the standard Colton maintained, which was the standard of a man who believed that the appearance of a household reflected directly on the competence of the person managing it. They had not argued before the guests arrived. Arguments with Colton, she told me, rarely had clear beginnings. They had a temperature that rose gradually until something small became the trigger for everything that had been building underneath. The small thing that night was a bottle of wine. She had opened the wrong vintage for one of the senior partners, Colton noticed. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice when there were witnesses. He leaned close to her ear in the kitchen and told her she needed to go upstairs and rest. He said the word rest the way he said most instructions, quietly and without negotiation. She went upstairs. She heard the bedroom door close behind her. Then she heard the electronic chirp of the smart lock engaging from the outside, a sound she had heard before, a sound that meant the app on Colton's phone had just sealed the room. At first, she thought it might have been a mistake. She tried the handle. It did not turn. She knocked on the door and called his name once. Below her, through the floor, she could hear the party continuing, glasses and conversation and music, the sounds of 30 people enjoying an evening in the rooms of a house where she was locked in an upstairs bedroom, and no one noticed or no one cared. She went to the window. The bedroom was on the second floor, and the window had been fitted with an exterior security bar that Colton had installed the previous spring. He had explained it as a precaution against break-ins. She had not questioned it at the time, because by that point, she had stopped questioning most of the things Colton did to the house, the way you stop questioning weather, not because it makes sense but because it is larger than you, and there is nothing to be done about it. She sat on the bed for nearly 2 hours. She told me this part without expression, the way a person describes a commute or a waiting room. Something endured rather than experienced. After the second hour, she heard the party beginning to thin. Car doors closing in the driveway. Engines starting. She tried the door again. Still locked. She told me what happened next in the flat, careful voice of someone who has rehearsed an account many times in private, without ever intending to speak it aloud. She removed the decorative rod from the curtain above the side window, the smaller window that Colton had not fitted with a bar because it was too narrow for a person to pass through comfortably. She broke the glass. She squeezed through the frame and lowered herself onto the roof of the back porch, cutting her left forearm on a piece of the remaining glass. From the porch roof, she dropped into the snow beside the house. She was wearing the silk blouse she had put on for the party. No coat, no shoes. She had no phone either. Or rather, she had a phone with 4% battery and a contact list that no longer contained my number. It had been removed 3 months earlier. She had not noticed until that moment because for 3 months there had always been some reason not to call me. Some complication that arose whenever she considered reaching out. She recognized that pattern now. Standing barefoot in the snow. She had not recognized it while she was inside it. She knew the birch forest behind the development. Not well. Not the way she had known it as a girl. When I used to walk those trails with her on Saturday mornings, teaching her to identify trees by the sound the wind made through their canopy, birch versus pine versus hemlock. Each one different if you knew how to listen. She knew the general direction. She knew that if she followed the downward slope of the terrain and kept the sound of the highway to her right, she would eventually reach the road that led to my house. She turned off the phone to save what remained of the battery. She walked into the forest. She told me she did not let herself stop. She had read somewhere years ago that the most dangerous thing you can do in extreme cold is sit down, because the warmth goes with the movement, and once it leaves, it is very hard to call back. So she kept moving. When she fell, she got up. When a branch caught her hand and opened a cut across her palm, she pressed it against her side and kept walking. When her feet went from painful to numb, she focused on her knees, on the mechanical rhythm of lifting and placing each step. The trees at night in a snowstorm are not quiet the way people imagine. The wind moves through the birch canopy in a continuous low whisper, and the snow falls with a kind of weighted silence that presses against the eardrums. She told me she talked to herself for a while just to hear a voice. Then, she saved her breath for walking. When she finally saw the light from my house, through the trees, just the faint warm glow of the porch lamp cutting through the snow, she stopped for the first time. She stood in the dark with the cold pressing in from every direction, and she told me she genuinely could not tell whether the light was real or whether her mind had simply decided to give her something to walk toward. The light had been real. She had made it to my door. That was the only thing that mattered in those first hours. But sitting beside her in that ambulance, listening to the sirens and the steady beeping of the monitors and the sound of my daughter's voice finally telling someone the truth, I kept coming back to one detail that sat in my chest heavier than all the others. My number had been removed from her phone. For 3 months, my daughter had not been able to call me, and she had not known it, because the absence had been engineered so carefully that it felt like her own choice. That is what control looks like when it is done by someone who understands architecture. You do not build walls. You remove doors so quietly that the person inside believes they chose to stay. There is a particular quality to fluorescent light at 4:30 in the morning that has nothing to do with brightness. It flattens everything. It strips the color from faces and turns hospital walls into something that has stopped trying to look like anything other than what it is. I had been inside UP Health System Marquette more times than I cared to count during the last year of Margaret's illness, sitting in chairs that were designed for function rather than comfort, listening to machines speak in frequencies that I understood better than most of the people operating them. I had never found those lights welcoming, but I had never been more grateful to be standing under them than I was that morning, walking beside my daughter's gurney as the paramedics wheeled her through the automatic doors. I kept her hand in mine until they asked me to step back. Then I found a spot against the wall and stayed there, close enough to watch while the emergency department moved around us with the quiet efficiency of people who have learned not to waste motion at this hour. The sounds were familiar to me in the way hospital sounds become familiar when you have spent enough time inside them. The rhythmic beeping of monitors at slightly different intervals, each one tracking a different patient, creating an unintentional polyrhythm that filled the corridor. The soft percussion of rubber soles on linoleum. The murmured exchanges between nurses that carried information in their cadence as much as in their words. The physician who took Ren's case introduced himself as Dr. Einar Lindgren, late 40s. The kind of steady, unhurried manner I associated with people who had seen enough emergencies to stop being surprised by them. Scandinavian surname, which in the Upper Peninsula was as common as birch trees and carried the same quiet resilience. He worked through the assessment methodically, checking her temperature, her circulation, her responses. He asked questions in a calm, measured voice, and she answered in a voice still uneven from the cold and from everything else. I watched Dr. Lindgren's hands the way I had watched hands for 28 years. In my profession, you learn that hands often communicate what the face is trained to conceal. His moved through the examination with professional composure until he reached her left shoulder. He eased the hospital gown aside, looked at what was there, and then looked again. His hands did not stop moving, but his eyes stayed on that section of skin for 3 seconds longer than a standard examination required. I counted. 3 seconds is a long time when you are watching someone see something they were not expecting to find. What he had found was a bruise on the inside of her left shoulder, approximately the size and shape of 4 fingertips pressed firmly into muscle. It was not fresh. The coloring placed it at roughly 2 weeks old, which meant it had been sustained around the beginning of December, during a period when Ren had not called me and I had not been able to reach her. Dr. Lindgren did not say anything. He did not need to. He finished the examination, ordered a warming blanket and an intravenous line, and stepped into the hallway. I heard him pick up the phone at the nurse's station. I knew what kind of call it was. Mandatory reporting. The officer arrived 22 minutes later. She was a woman in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back, and the focused, attentive posture of someone who took her work seriously. She introduced herself as Officer Tanya Birch with the Marquette Police Department and pulled a chair beside Wren's bed. She opened a notepad and asked Wren gently whether she would be willing to describe what had happened. Wren looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she started talking. I stood against the wall with my arms crossed and I listened and I kept my face still because Wren needed the room to be steady and I was going to make it steady for her regardless of what it cost me to hear what she was saying. She told Officer Birch about the bank accounts. A consolidation, Colton had called it. Her name remained on the paperwork, but the withdrawal limit had been set to $30 without her knowledge. She told her about the job. She had been a speech-language pathologist working with autistic children at a clinic on the north side of Marquette, a position she had held for 4 years, and loved in a way that came through even now in the flatness of her voice. Colton had raised concerns about her hours, about stress, about whether the work was necessary given his income. She had stopped working the previous January. She told Officer Birch about the list. Colton kept a list on his phone of people he considered unsuitable influences. Her college roommate, 2 colleagues from the clinic, a neighbor who had invited her to coffee one morning while Colton was at the office. One by one, contact with each person had been discouraged, then actively prevented, then simply erased from the architecture of her daily life until the absence felt normal because there was nothing left to compare it to. She told her about the sounds. This was the part that made me press my shoulders harder against the wall. Wren said she had always felt watched inside the house, even when Colton was at the office. She described a persistent feeling of being listened to, a sensation she had attributed to anxiety, to the stress of the marriage, to the particular paranoia that grows inside a person who has been told often enough that their perceptions cannot be trusted. She had never found the source. She did not know about the microphones. I did. I had known since July, and standing there in that hospital room listening to my daughter describe the feeling of being monitored by equipment she could not see, I carried the weight of that knowledge, the way I had carried it for 5 months, carefully, silently, knowing that the moment I revealed it had to be the right moment or everything I had built would come apart. Officer Birch wrote steadily. Her pen pressed hard against the page. I recognized that pressure from years of watching people write when what they were hearing was difficult and there was no time to sit with it. She was doing her job and doing it well, and I noted that for later, because later I was going to need people who did their jobs well. The room settled into a temporary quiet when Wren finished. The monitors beeped. The warming blanket hummed at a low frequency against her legs. Officer Birch closed her notepad and told Wren she would file the report within 24 hours and that someone from the department would follow up. Then I heard the footsteps. They came from the far end of the corridor, moving toward us at a pace that was deliberate and evenly spaced, the particular rhythm of a man who walked that way on purpose. I had spent enough years listening to the way people move to know the difference between someone walking to reach a destination and someone walking to announce an arrival. I knew that cadence. I had heard it once before at a firm reception 2 winters ago, crossing a polished floor in a room full of people who turned to look. I did not need to see the face at the end of the hallway to know who it belonged to. My body knew before my eyes confirmed it. The footsteps grew louder, closer, each one landing with the measured confidence of a man who still believed he was in control of the room he was about to enter. He filled the doorway the way certain men fill doorways, with the kind of deliberate physical presence that announces itself before a single word has been spoken. I had met Colton Ashford exactly 4 times before that morning. A dinner downtown when Wren first introduced us 2 years prior. A holiday gathering the following December that lasted 90 minutes and ended with a handshake I had driven home thinking about for reasons I could not yet name. A chance meeting at a hardware store last spring where he had been friendly in a way that required considerable effort to look effortless. And once at a firm reception where I had watched him work a room with the smooth efficiency of a man who understood that every interaction was an investment. 4 meetings, 96 total minutes of direct observation. That was more than enough. In 28 years of analyzing human behavior through the medium of sound, I had learned that most people reveal themselves completely within the first 40 seconds of sustained interaction. The rest is repetition. He was wearing a charcoal suit that had no business being that pressed at this hour, which told me he had gone home and changed before coming to the hospital. His hair was neat. His expression carried exactly the right proportion of concern to composure. The face of a devoted husband holding himself together for the sake of everyone in the room. It was a performance. I had seen better in federal interrogation footage, but not many. He went to Wren first. He said her name softly and reached for her hand. I watched her body do something I had spent 3 decades reading about in forensic behavioral analysis reports, but had never witnessed in someone I loved. The involuntary tightening of preparation, the microcontraction of the shoulders and forearms that occurs when a person who has learned to anticipate contact braces for it without conscious intention. She let him take her hand. She did not turn toward him. She kept her eyes fixed on the middle distance and said she was fine in the tone people use when fine is a lid they are holding down over something that would consume the room if they let it rise. Then he turned to me. He crossed the room in 3 steps and lowered his voice, which was the first tactical decision I catalogued. A man who lowers his voice in a hospital room is a man who understands that the people within earshot are potential witnesses and that the acoustic environment can be managed. I had built entire cases on that understanding. "Hugh, I want you to know," he said quietly, "that I understand why you are here. And I want you to know that whatever Wren has told you, there are always 2 sides to a situation like this." I did not respond. He took my silence as an invitation to continue, which was precisely what I intended. 28 years of interviews had taught me that silence is not empty. Silence is a space that human beings feel compelled to fill, and what they choose to fill it with tells you more than any question you could ask. It is the most effective interrogation tool ever developed, and it costs nothing to deploy. Colton filled it. He raised his volume just slightly, not enough to be called a scene, but enough for Officer Birch at the nurse's station to catch individual words if she was listening. He spoke about misunderstandings, about difficult periods in a marriage, about a father-in-law who had never fully accepted him, and who had perhaps encouraged his daughter to interpret normal marital stress as something more sinister. He used the word fragile twice when describing Wren. He used the phrase anxiety episodes 3 times. Each repetition was spaced at intervals that suggested rehearsal rather than spontaneity. I stood with my back against the wall and I listened the way I had listened to thousands of hours of recorded human speech. Not to the words, but to what was underneath them. The architecture of deception has a specific acoustic signature. Pitch rises by an average of 12 to 18 hertz when a person is constructing a narrative rather than recalling one. Breathing patterns shift. Micropauses appear before emotionally loaded words, not because the speaker is feeling the emotion, but because they are selecting it. Consonant articulation sharpens as the jaw tightens under the strain of maintaining a fabricated account over extended duration. Colton exhibited every one of these markers. His baseline pitch when he entered the room had been approximately 115 hertz. Within 4 minutes of sustained performance, it had climbed to 131. His breathing shifted from diaphragmatic to thoracic at the 2-minute mark. He inserted micropauses before the words love, worried, and family that were 0.3 seconds longer than natural speech requires. His jaw tension increased steadily, audible in the way his sibilant consonants grew sharper. As the performance continued, he was lying, comprehensively, and with considerable skill. But he was lying to a man who had spent 28 years building a career on the precise detection of exactly this kind of deception, and the difference between a skilled liar and an undetectable one is the difference between a good forgery and an original. One of them always has seams. He shifted tactics after approximately 4 minutes. When he understood that I was not going to interrupt, was not going to defend myself, was not going to give him anything to work with, the reasonable tone dropped a register. Something harder came through underneath. the way the frame of a building shows when the surface material starts to fail. He leaned close. His voice dropped to a whisper. A whisper has a specific acoustic profile that distinguishes it from quiet speech. Quiet speech maintains tonal quality. A whisper strips it away, leaving only the sibilance and the breath. And the effect is something that feels closer and more intimate, and considerably more threatening than volume. "You have no idea who you are dealing with, old man," he said. "I will take apart everything you have. Your credibility, your reputation, whatever pathetic case you think you are building. I have resources you cannot match, and I will use every single one of them." I looked at him. His pitch had dropped to its lowest register. His breathing was even. His micro-pauses had disappeared entirely. There was no jaw tension, no sibilant sharpening, no indicators of constructed speech. He was not performing anymore. For the first time, in 9 minutes of sustained interaction, Colton Ashford was telling the absolute truth. I filed that. I filed the pitch, the cadence, the breath pattern, the particular frequency of his voice when it carried genuine intention rather than manufactured emotion. I filed it beside everything else I had been collecting for 5 months. Beside the audio files and the access logs and the documentation that sat in a fireproof safe bolted to the floor of my bedroom closet, waiting. He straightened. He adjusted his jacket. He turned and walked out of the room with the measured stride of a man who believed the conversation had gone exactly the way he planned. I watched him go. I did not say a single word during the entire exchange, because there was nothing I needed to say. The safe in my closet held a USB drive that contained 5 months of evidence recorded by microphones Colton himself had installed inside the walls of his own home. Every threat he had made, every command he had given, every lie, time-stamped and authenticated, waiting in the dark for the moment when the door of that safe would open and the silence would finally end. That moment was closer now than it had been an hour ago. Possibly much closer. She arrived without knocking, which told me everything I needed to know about how many doors she had walked through in 24 years of this work. Sandra Kowalski, Adult Protective Services Division, Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. She held up an identification badge briefly, then let it fall against her jacket, the way a person handles credentials they have shown 10,000 times. She was a broad-shouldered woman with reading glasses pushed to her forehead and a clipboard held across her body like something that had become part of how she stood. The clipboard was not decorative. It was worn at the corners and thick with forms, and it had the particular utility of an object that had been carried into rooms far more difficult than this one. She reminded me of the senior field supervisors I had worked beside during my first decade at the Bureau. People who had stopped softening their language because softness cost time, and time in their line of work was a resource that someone else was always paying for. She pulled a chair to the side of the bed without asking permission and sat down. She looked at Ren, then at me, then back at Ren with the particular economy of someone who had learned to read a room in the first 10 seconds or spend the rest of the visit at a disadvantage. She laid out her requirements without preamble. Documentation of Ren's immediate living situation. Medical records from Dr. Lindgren, to be submitted within 48 hours. A formal statement from Officer Birch filed with the APS intake office within 72 hours. A follow-up safety assessment conducted by Sandra herself, scheduled within 24 hours of the initial report. She delivered each requirement in the same flat register, the voice of a system that operated on procedure rather than sentiment. And I respected that because I had spent my career inside a system that worked the same way. I did not interrupt her. I had learned decades ago that interrupting people who hold authority over something you need is a strategy that rarely benefits anyone. I answered her questions directly and without elaboration. Yes, Ren would be staying with me for the immediate future. Yes, I could provide a safe and stable environment. No, I had no prior record that would complicate a placement assessment. She wrote each answer without looking up. When she finished the procedural portion, she closed the clipboard and looked at me. The reading glasses stayed on her forehead. Her expression carried something that sat between professional caution and a kind of reluctant recognition, the look of someone who had been in enough of these rooms to know the difference between a family member who was performing concern and one who had been quietly doing something about the situation long before she arrived. She did not say what she was thinking. She did not need to. 28 years of reading people through their voices had also made me fluent in the things people communicated without speaking. 24 hours. Mr. Callister, she said. I will return for the safety assessment. In the meantime, your daughter is not to have contact with Mr. Ashford without prior coordination through this office. I understand, I said. She looked at me for a moment longer than the conversation required. Then she picked up the clipboard, straightened her jacket, and walked out of the room, without looking back. The door settled closed behind her with the soft mechanical click of hospital hardware, and the room held her absence for a moment, the way a room holds the absence of anyone who has occupied it with that degree of certainty. I stood in the quiet she left behind, and let it settle. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. The warming blanket hummed against Wren's legs. Outside the window, the blizzard had eased to a steady snowfall. The flakes smaller now, falling straight down in the absence of wind, covering the parking lot and the roofline of the building opposite. In a silence that was patient and thorough, Wren had fallen asleep. Her breathing had deepened into the particular rhythm of someone whose body had finally been given permission to stop fighting, and had taken that permission immediately and completely. Her face in sleep looked younger than it had looked since she arrived at my door. The tension around her jaw and temples releasing into something softer, something I recognized from years ago when she was a girl and would fall asleep on the couch while I worked late at the kitchen table and Margaret read in the armchair beside the lamp. I watched her for a moment. Then I looked down the corridor, toward the exit. Somewhere beyond that door was my house, and inside that house was my bedroom, and inside the closet of that bedroom was a fireproof safe bolted to the floor behind the winter coats. Inside that safe was a USB drive that held 5 months of documentation I had assembled quietly and methodically since the second week of July. Beside the safe, leaning against the closet wall, was the case that held my Brule and Kjær forensic audio analysis equipment, the tools I had carried through 28 years and 247 cases, the instruments that had been my hands and ears in every room I had ever worked. I was going to sell them. I had known it since the moment I saw the marks on Wren's arms, though I had not yet said it aloud. The equipment was worth approximately $12,000 to the right buyer. In the driveway sat the Jeep, the 1998 Wrangler, that Margaret had named Old Bear on the morning. I drove it home for the first time, the vehicle we had taken on every back road and lakefront trail in the Upper Peninsula. Across 15 years of weekends and summers, and the particular kind of quiet happiness that does not announce itself, but simply shows up and stays. The Jeep would bring another 11,000, perhaps 12 from someone who understood what it was. Together, that would be enough. Enough to retain the kind of attorney who could take what was on that USB drive and turn it into something that Colton Ashford's resources and reputation and firm connections could not dismantle. Enough to build a wall between my daughter and the man who had locked her in a room and waited for the cold to solve whatever problem she represented. I looked at Wren sleeping. I looked at my hands. These hands had operated precision equipment for nearly 3 decades. They had adjusted microphone sensitivity to tolerances measured in fractions of a decibel. They had held Margaret's hands in this same hospital during the months when holding was the only useful thing left to do. They had pulled my daughter off a frozen porch 4 hours ago. Now they were going to do one more thing. They were going to let go of everything they had held onto for 28 years so that the one thing that actually mattered could be held onto instead. I did not need to think about it further. The decision had already been made. It had been made the moment I opened my front door and saw her kneeling in the snow. Everything since then had simply been the sequence of understanding what that decision required. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time before I touched the equipment case. It was leaning against the closet wall where it had been standing since the day I retired. A matte black Pelican case with reinforced latches and a small dent on the upper left corner from an incident in a field office in Detroit in 2008 that I had never bothered to repair. Inside was the Brule and Kjaer forensic audio analysis system that had been my primary instrument for the last 19 years of my career. Microphones calibrated to sensitivities that most commercial equipment could not approach. A spectrum analyzer that could isolate a whispered conversation from a room full of ambient noise. The particular assemblage of precision tools that had allowed me to do what I did for 28 years, which was to find the truth hiding inside sound. I opened the case. The foam inserts held each component in its exact position, undisturbed since the last time I had used the system professionally. I ran my fingers along the edge of the primary microphone housing. I had held this instrument in more courtrooms than I could count. I had carried it into rooms where the evidence it produced had put people in prison, and into rooms where the evidence it produced had kept innocent people out. It was not a sentimental object. It was a tool. But tools that you carry for 28 years stop being only tools. They become part of the way you move through the world, extensions of the senses you have trained around them. Before I closed the case, I removed 6 small condenser microphones from the accessory compartment. They were compact units, each no larger than a shirt button, designed for covert field recording in situations where standard equipment would be detected. I had requisitioned them during my last year at the Bureau, and they had been signed over to me upon retirement as surplus inventory. I put them in a small canvas bag and placed the bag in the kitchen drawer beside the flashlight. I did not know precisely when I would need them. I knew that I would. I drove to the campus of Northern Michigan University and carried the case into the Acoustic Sciences department. The professor who met me had been inquiring about the system for 2 years through a mutual contact. He examined each component with the careful hands of a man who understood what he was looking at. He offered $12,000. I accepted without negotiation. He counted out the payment in a cashier's check, and I signed the transfer form, and I did not look at the case again once I set it on his laboratory table. The second call was harder. Hank Bergstrom had been fishing with me on Lake Superior every other Saturday for 10 years, and he had admired the Jeep since the first morning he saw it parked outside my house, engine ticking in the cold, snow on the hood. We had talked about it twice in the way men talk about vehicles they respect, brief exchanges that carried more meaning than the words suggested. I had never been willing to sell. Margaret had named that Jeep. She had called it Old Bear on the morning I brought it home, standing in the driveway with her coffee in both hands and her head tilted, studying it the way she studied everything, with the particular attention of a woman who believed that all things worth keeping deserved a name. Every bear needs a name, she had said. Or it is just a machine. I called Hank and told him I needed to sell the Jeep today. There was a pause on the line. Today, he said. Today. He arrived 40 minutes later with a cashier's check for $11,500 and a flatbed trailer. We shook hands in the driveway. I handed him the keys and the signed title. He began loading the Jeep onto the trailer, and I watched for a moment, the green paint against the white snow, the particular shape of a vehicle I had driven through every season of the Upper Peninsula for 15 years. Margaret had ridden in the passenger seat on hundreds of mornings. She had rested her left hand on the center console and her right hand against the window frame, and she had looked out at the lake or the forest or the snow with the quiet absorption of a woman who found the world continuously interesting and never felt the need to say so. The last time she had ridden in that Jeep had been 11 months before she died, a Sunday morning drive along the lakefront when she was still strong enough to sit upright, and the autumn light on Superior had been the color of copper. I thought about what she would have said if she were standing in this driveway right now, watching me sell her bear. I did not have to think long. She would have said exactly what she told me once during the last winter of her illness, sitting in the armchair beside the lamp, with a blanket across her knees, and her voice already beginning to carry the particular thinness that I could measure in frequencies, but could not stop. "Protect what makes sound in this house, Hugh," she had said. "The silence is what kills." I turned away from the trailer before Hank finished securing the straps. I called a car and rode across town to the building on Washington Street that housed the offices of Vivian Cross, attorney at law. Her practice occupied the second floor directly across from the Marquette County Courthouse. I had spent the previous night researching her at the hospital on my phone while Ren slept, reading case records and bar association filings until the screen made my eyes ache. 26 years in practice. A record that other attorneys in the Upper Peninsula discussed with the kind of careful respect that indicated they had been on the opposing side of it and preferred not to repeat the experience. Her assistant showed me in at 2:30. The office smelled of old paper and radiator heat. Through the window behind the desk, the courthouse stood against a gray December sky, its stone face the same color as the clouds. Vivian Cross was a trim woman in her mid-50s with silver hair cut short and the settled bearing of someone who had stopped being surprised by what people brought through her door a long time ago. Her voice, when she spoke, had a quality I recognized from years of analyzing vocal patterns. It was a voice that had been deliberately stripped of everything unnecessary, leaving only precision and a kind of controlled warmth that she deployed selectively rather than by default. I did not sit down immediately. I placed the envelope on her mahogany desk first. $18,000 in cash, banded in sets of 500. Everything, the equipment and the Jeep, had returned to me. Then I reached into my coat pocket and set the USB drive beside the envelope. A small black rectangle, no larger than my thumb. 5 months of documentation, assembled quietly and methodically since the second week of July. Built the same way I had built case files for 28 years, in language that would hold up in front of anyone who cared to examine it. Vivian looked at the money. She looked at the drive. She looked at me. "Where did you get all this?" she asked. 28 years of listening," I said. She opened her laptop. The screen cast a pale blue light across the desk between us. She inserted the USB drive with the careful motion of a woman who understood that what she was about to examine would require her full attention. A single folder appeared on the screen, labeled in plain text. Ren. Audio. Evidence. July to December. She looked at it. Then, she looked at me. "Start from the beginning," she said. It started in July. The second week of the month, a Wednesday afternoon that was unremarkable in every way, except for the thing I heard inside a house where I was not supposed to be listening. Colton had invited me to fix a leaking pipe under the kitchen sink. He had framed it as a favor, the kind of gesture a son-in-law makes to appear inclusive. He had called me on a Sunday evening and used the word family twice in a 4-minute conversation, and I had accepted without hesitation because walking into that house with a legitimate reason to be there was exactly the kind of opportunity I had spent 3 decades learning to recognize. I arrived at 2 in the afternoon. The house sat on a hill on the north side of Marquette. A large, modern construction set back from the road with a long driveway lined by birch trees that had been planted at precise intervals. It was the kind of property that announced its owner's success without requiring a word to be spoken. Every surface maintained, every angle deliberate, the architectural equivalent of a man who never appeared in public without first checking his reflection. Colton met me at the door. He was dressed casually, in a way that took effort. The kind of effort I had watched him apply to everything since the first time we met. He showed me the kitchen, pointed out the pipe, and handed me a wrench. Then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, told me he needed to take the call, and stepped outside through the back door. I was alone in the house. I knelt under the kitchen sink and examined the pipe. The leak was minor. A compression fitting that needed tightening, a 3-minute repair at most. I tightened the fitting and wiped the joint, and then I stood up. And I heard it. 14,200 hertz. A thin, constant tone sitting at the upper edge of the frequency range that most adult humans can detect, well above the threshold where conscious awareness typically begins to fade. Most people in their 30s would not hear it. Most people in their 60s certainly would not. But I was not most people. I had spent 28 years training my ears to detect anomalies in acoustic environments, to identify sounds that did not belong, to hear the thing that was present in a room but was not supposed to be there. My hearing had been tested annually throughout my career, and had remained within the top 3% of the population for frequency detection at every assessment. The Bureau had considered this an asset. It was about to become something else entirely. The tone was coming from the east wall of the kitchen, approximately 4 feet above the floor. I crossed the room and stood beside it. The sound was faint enough that I had to hold my breath to isolate it from the ambient noise of the house, the refrigerator, the central heating, the distant hum of the electrical system. But it was there, steady, continuous. The characteristic feedback signature of an active condenser microphone operating in a closed environment. I looked at the wall. There was an electrical outlet at the approximate height where I had localized the sound. I leaned close without touching it. The outlet cover was standard residential hardware, white plastic, 2 receptacles. Nothing remarkable to a casual observer. But the screw heads were slightly recessed in a way that indicated the cover had been removed and reinstalled more than once, and the faceplate sat a fraction of a millimeter proud of the wall surface, which meant something behind it was occupying space that a standard electrical box would not require. There was a microphone inside that outlet. I was certain of it the way I was certain of any acoustic identification I had made in 28 years of professional practice. The frequency, the amplitude, the directional characteristics of the sound were consistent with a miniature condenser element positioned behind a permeable cover, and the feedback tone indicated it was active, powered, and transmitting or recording in real time. I did not touch it. I did not remove the cover. I did not take a photograph. I stepped back from the wall and continued my survey of the house, moving casually through the rooms with the unhurried attention of a man who was simply stretching his legs after a minor plumbing repair. In the living room, I found the second one. Same outlet configuration. Same frequency signature, though shifted slightly higher due to the different acoustic properties of the room. In the master bedroom, I found the third. This one was positioned beside the bed, which meant it was optimized for close-range vocal capture, the kind of placement you choose when the conversations you want to record happen at speaking volume between 2 people lying next to each other in the dark. 3 microphones. 3 rooms. An active surveillance system installed inside the walls of my daughter's home by the man she was married to, monitoring every word she spoke in every room where words were likely to be spoken. I completed my circuit of the house and returned to the kitchen. Colton came back inside 2 minutes later. The phone call concluded. His manner easy and relaxed, in the way it always was, when he believed everything was proceeding according to his design. He thanked me for the repair. He offered me a cup of coffee. I accepted. We sat at the kitchen table and made conversation for 11 minutes, while the microphone in the wall 4 feet from my left shoulder recorded every word we said. I drove home along the lakefront road with the windows down despite the July heat, because I needed the sound of the wind and the water to fill the space inside the vehicle that my thoughts were trying to occupy. I pulled into my driveway and sat behind the wheel, without turning off the engine for a long time. I thought about Ren. I thought about the 3 microphones. I thought about the particular kind of man who installs listening devices inside the walls of his own home to monitor the woman who lives there, and does it not in secret from the world, but in secret from her alone. I thought about calling the police. I thought about it for exactly the length of time it took me to understand why I could not. Colton Ashford was a named partner at a firm with connections to every level of the county legal system. He sat on the advisory board of the hospital. He contributed to 3 local nonprofits. A father-in-law's accusation, presented without documentation, based on a sound that most people could not hear emanating from an outlet that looked entirely normal, would have been noted and filed and forgotten before the week was out. I needed something that could not be argued away. I picked up the phone and called Roy Pemberton. Roy had been a digital forensics specialist at the Bureau for 22 years before retiring to a cabin near Iron Mountain, 60 miles south of Marquette. He was 65 years old with a voice like gravel and a habit of listening to an entire explanation before responding with the fewest possible words. I told him what I had found. I told him what I suspected. I told him I needed to access whatever system Colton was using to store the audio these microphones were capturing. Roy was quiet for 10 seconds. In my experience, 10 seconds of silence from Roy Pemberton meant he was not deciding whether to help, but rather calculating the most efficient method. "What kind of cloud service is he using?" Roy asked. "Commercial," I said. "Standard encryption. Consumer grade. Then we can get in," he said. Roy drove up from Iron Mountain the following Saturday. He arrived at 7 in the morning with a laptop that looked like it had survived a deployment, a thermos of coffee he did not offer to share, and the particular economy of movement that characterized everything about him. We sat at my kitchen table, and he walked me through the system. Colton was using a commercial cloud storage service to archive the audio from the microphones. The service was consumer grade, built to protect against casual intrusion rather than against someone with 22 years of federal digital forensics experience. Roy identified the access point within 40 minutes. He configured a mirrored download protocol that would copy new audio files to my system each time they were uploaded without triggering any notification on Colton's account. He tested it twice, confirmed the pathway was clean, and closed his laptop. "Do not access the cloud directly after today," he said. "Let the mirror do the work. If he checks his logs, which he will not, because men like this never believe anyone is watching them, there will be nothing to find." He finished his coffee, shook my hand, and drove back to Iron Mountain. The first files arrived that evening. I sat at the kitchen table with my headphones on and pressed play. What came through was the interior of my daughter's home rendered in high-fidelity detail. I could hear the central heating cycle. I could hear the refrigerator compressor engage every 23 minutes. I could hear the acoustic signature of each room, the kitchen bright and reverberant, the bedroom intimate and close, optimized for capturing the human voice at conversational volume. And I could hear Wren, moving through her own home, opening cabinets, running water. I listened to her hum, a melody I recognized from her childhood, while she cooked dinner. I listened to her speak to herself quietly while she folded laundry. The kind of half-voiced self-talk people produce when they believe they are alone. She was not alone. She had not been alone in that house since the day the microphones were installed. Then I heard Colton. His voice in the privacy of his home was different from the voice at dinners and gatherings. The public Colton operated at a carefully modulated pitch, warm, measured. The private Colton spoke in a register that was lower and flatter and carried an authority that did not request compliance but assumed it. "You will not call anyone," he said on the recording dated the 19th of August. "You will not leave this house without telling me where you are going and when you will return. You will do exactly what I tell you. Do you understand?" Her response was 2 words. "I understand." I sat with my headphones on at 11 at night and listened to my daughter say those words, and the professional detachment I had relied on for 28 years failed me for the first time. I took the headphones off. I put my hands flat on the table and pressed until my knuckles went white, and I stayed that way for a long time. Then I put the headphones back on because the case was not going to build itself, and every night I spent not listening was a night my daughter spent inside that house with those microphones and that man. The files accumulated. I developed a system. Each evening I reviewed the day's recordings, logging timestamps, transcribing exchanges, cross-referencing vocal patterns against the baseline profile I had built for Colton. I maintained a separate log for Wren, tracking changes in her fundamental frequency, because the human voice under sustained psychological duress undergoes measurable shifts. The pitch narrows. The dynamic range compresses. The prosodic variation that characterizes healthy speech flattens into what clinicians call vocal effect reduction. I was watching my daughter's voice disappear one frequency at a time. By October, I had cataloged over 300 hours. By November, over 400. The evidentiary material fell into categories. Direct commands where Colton instructed Wren regarding her movements, contacts, and finances. Threats delivered in the low-flat register I had identified as his authentic voice. A conversation with his personal attorney discussing strategies for managing the situation if she talks. A phrase he used twice with the comfort of repetition. And there was the recording from the 14th of October. Colton on the phone with a friend, captured by the bedroom microphone at 11:40 in the evening while Ren slept beside him. His voice relaxed. Pitch at its lowest natural register. No performance. I handled it before with the last one, he said. Same approach, different girl. It is not complicated once you understand how they work. I replayed that sentence 4 times. I ran a spectrographic analysis and confirmed a 99.7% voice match against his baseline. I checked the metadata, confirmed the timestamp was authentic, and the file unmodified. Then I saved it and sat in the dark thinking about the phrase, the last one. There had been someone before Ren. Someone inside the same system, subjected to the same architecture of control. I did not know who she was or where she was, but I knew she existed because I had heard her referenced in the voice of the man who had done to her whatever he was now doing to my daughter, described with the casual efficiency of someone reviewing a process that had been tested and refined. I closed my laptop. The kitchen was dark. The heater clicked on. Outside, the November wind moved through the birch trees in the long, low sound I had been hearing for 9 years. It no longer sounded the same. Nothing in this house sounded the same since July. Every frequency had been rewritten by what I knew. I was no longer building a case. I was building an arc. And somewhere beyond the trees and the snow and the silence, there was a woman I had not yet found who held the other half of the story I was assembling in the dark. The call came 2 days after I retained Vivian. My phone vibrated on the arm of the hospital chair, where I was sitting beside Ren's bed, watching her sleep while the monitors kept their steady rhythm. The number was unfamiliar. No name, no area code I could place. I almost let it go to voicemail, which is what I did with most calls from numbers I did not recognize, a habit left over from decades of carrying a device that was always one notification away from something requiring immediate attention. I answered. The voice on the other end was careful and measured in the way people speak when they have rehearsed what they are going to say but are still afraid of saying it. She told me her name was Phoebe Langston. She told me she had seen the name Colton Ashford on a local news update that morning. A brief item about an ongoing Adult Protective Services investigation. Nothing detailed, just enough to surface a name she had spent 3 years trying to stop thinking about. She told me she was at UP Health System right now, in the main corridor near the east entrance. She said she would understand completely if I did not want to come. I told her to stay where she was. I recognized her before she recognized me. She was standing near the far end of the corridor beside a row of chairs along the window wall, wearing a gray wool coat and holding a paper cup of coffee she had not touched. 33 years old, according to what she had told me on the phone, though she carried herself with the particular stillness of someone considerably older. Not the stillness of calm. The stillness of a person who had learned over a long period of time to take up as little space as possible. When I introduced myself, she looked at me with eyes I recognized immediately, though I had never seen her face before. They were the same eyes I had seen on Ren in the ambulance and in the hospital bed and in the grocery store in September, when I had first noticed something wrong. The eyes of someone who had lived inside a situation that no one on the outside could quite believe and had stopped expecting to be believed. We sat down together in the chairs by the window. She told me the year was 2021 when it began. She had met Colton at a firm networking event in downtown Marquette. He was charming, attentive, the kind of man who made a room feel smaller in a way that seemed at first like a gift. They had been together for 14 months. She had been a junior associate at his firm. The pattern she described was identical to what I had documented over 5 months of listening. The financial access restricted, then redirected. The social connections contracted one by one until the calls stopped entirely. The phone contacts edited without her knowledge. The particular feeling of being monitored inside her own home that she had attributed to anxiety because the alternative was too large to hold. She had reported it to the Marquette Police Department in the autumn of 2021. She had gone in person, filed a formal statement, provided what documentation she had. Colton's attorney had appeared within 48 hours. The case file had been reviewed, assessed as lacking sufficient physical evidence, and closed. She had left Marquette within the month, moved to Wisconsin. changed her phone number. Started over in the way people start over. When starting over means building an entirely new life on top of the wreckage of the one that was taken from them. He knew exactly how much to do, Phoebe said. Nothing he did left a mark that held up on paper. That was the point. Her hands were resting in her lap around the coffee cup, and they carried a fine, persistent tremor she made no effort to conceal. But her voice did not waver. She spoke with the flat precision of someone who had told this story to themselves so many times that the emotion had been worn smooth, leaving only the structure. "The case file," I said. "You still have a copy?" "I kept everything," she said. "The report number, the detective's name, the date it was closed. I kept it because I thought someday it might matter to someone." She reached into her bag and produced a folded envelope. She held it for a moment before placing it on the chair between us. "I thought I was the only one," she said. "I am sorry, I did not speak sooner. I did not tell her there was nothing to apologize for because that was not what she needed to hear. What I told her was that the document in that envelope had the potential to change the legal position of an ongoing case significantly, and that an attorney named Vivian Cross would almost certainly want to speak with her in the coming 2 days. She looked at me. "Will it help Ren?" "Yes," I said. "It will." She nodded once. The way people nod when they have been waiting a long time for a sentence that simple. I understood, walking back to the east entrance with the envelope in my coat pocket, what Phoebe's file represented in legal terms. A single incident, even one as thoroughly documented as the material on the USB drive, could be argued as a dispute between 2 people. 2 incidents separated by 3 years, with 2 different women following an identical pattern, shifted the argument entirely. It was no longer a question of whether Ren was telling the truth. It became a question of whether a court was willing to look at a documented pattern of deliberate conduct and call it what it was. I called Vivian from the sidewalk outside the hospital. She answered on the second ring. "There is a woman named Phoebe Langston," I said. "She was with Colton Ashford in 2021. Same pattern. She filed a police report that autumn. The case was closed for insufficient evidence, but the file still exists." There was a pause that lasted exactly as long as it takes an experienced attorney to understand the full weight of what she has just been told. "Can she testify?" Vivian asked. "She kept every document," I said. "And she is willing." Another pause, shorter. "Hugh," she said, "we do not just have a crime. We have a pattern that changes everything." I stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the sky, which had gone the deep, solid gray of late afternoon in December. Somewhere above the cloud line, the sun was still moving west toward the lake. I could not see it, but I knew it was there. Sandra Kowalski came back without the clipboard. I noticed its absence before I noticed anything else. Because in my experience, when a person whose presence is partially defined by the tools they carry arrives without those tools, something fundamental has shifted. She was wearing a dark coat over a gray sweater, her reading glasses pushed to her forehead in the same position they had occupied during our first meeting, but without the clipboard she looked like a different version of the same person. One who had decided to arrive today, carrying something other than procedure. She pulled the chair from the corner of the room to the side of my bed without asking permission and sat down. I had been moved to a private room following the wrist assessment the previous day, a precaution Dr. Lindgren had recommended given the circumstances. Ren was in the chair beside the window where she had been sitting since morning, her bandaged hands folded in her lap. "I will not take long," Sandra said. She looked at me, then at Ren, then back at me. I wanted to come in person. She reached into the leather folder she had been carrying under her arm and placed a document on the bedside table. 8 pages, dated that morning. She did not hand it to me. She set it down flat. The way you set something down when you want the other person to reach for it on their own terms. I could read the summary line from where I sat. Findings substantiated. Risk level high. Recommendation: immediate protective intervention and coordination with law enforcement. She told us what she had found when she entered the residence on the north side of Marquette 2 days earlier, accompanied by Officer Birch under standard APS protocol. Her voice was the same flat register she used for everything. But the content was something else entirely. The medicine cabinet in the primary bathroom contained a prescription anxiolytic issued in Wren's name. The bottle had been fitted with an aftermarket combination lock, the combination known only to Colton. The joint checking account had been placed in restricted access 31 days prior, requiring dual authorization for any withdrawal above $30. Wren's authorization credentials had been removed 17 days ago. The window in the second-floor bedroom, the room where Wren had been locked the night she fled, had been fitted with an exterior security bar mounted on the outside of the frame. And throughout the house, in outlet covers and smoke detector housings and behind light switch plates, Sandra's team had found 11 microphones. 11. I had identified 3 in July. Colton had installed 8 more in the month since. Sandra finished and looked at me without expression. "I know what a cage looks like, Mr. Callister," she said. Then she looked at Wren for a moment with something I had not seen from her before. Not warmth exactly, but adjacent to it. Recognition. "Your daughter is fortunate that you heard what others missed." She stood, straightened her coat, picked up her folder, and walked out. The room held her absence. Wren turned from the window and looked at the report on the bedside table. She did not reach for it. She did not need to. Sandra had just confirmed in the language of an official state document what Wren had been living inside for 2 years and what I had been listening to for 5 months. The architecture of the cage was now part of the public record. That afternoon, Wren turned on the television. She changed the channel twice before stopping. Colton was already at the microphone. He had chosen the steps of the Marquette County Courthouse as his backdrop, a deliberate choice that placed him in proximity to institutions of authority without requiring accountability to any of them. He was wearing a charcoal suit and no overcoat despite the cold. His hair was neat. His hands clasped at the angle that reads on camera as composure under pressure. He had been released on bail that morning. $25,000 posted by a colleague at the firm within 30 minutes of the hearing. The statement he gave lasted 12 minutes. In those 12 minutes, he described a marriage he characterized as loving and stable until the involvement of an outside party. He let the implication build before saying my name. When he did, he said it quietly with a pause before and after. Hugh Callister. His wife's father. A retired FBI analyst who had, in Colton's telling, used federal surveillance techniques to conduct an illegal monitoring campaign against his own son-in-law and had fabricated evidence to support the obsessive grievances of a man who could not release his daughter into her adult life. His voice broke once, approximately 9 minutes in. His eyes reddened. He looked briefly away from the camera and then back. I had analyzed enough performed emotion to know the difference. He was very good. Wren watched the screen without moving. When the broadcast ended, she reached out and turned the television off. "He is performing," she said. "Yes," I said. She looked at the blank screen. "I used to believe the performance." "You do not anymore." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No, I do not. I called Vivian at 11:47. She answered on the second ring. "I watched it," I said. "As did I," she said. "All 12 minutes. He violated 3 conditions of his bail this morning. Public statement regarding the case without court approval. Communication regarding named witnesses. Actions interpretable as intimidation of a complainant. I am filing the motion to revoke bail tonight." I looked at the window. The snow had started again. "There is something more immediate," Vivian said. Her voice shifted register, moving from information to warning. His attorney accessed the witness list through standard discovery. "It is a legal process. I cannot prevent it. But it means Colton now knows every name on that list." I already knew what she was going to say. "He knows Phoebe's name," Vivian said. The snow continued to fall. I thought about Phoebe Langston sitting alone in a house somewhere in Marquette with the lights off. A woman who had spent 3 years keeping herself at a careful distance from a man she had every reason to fear, and who had come forward anyway, because she had decided it mattered more than the risk. Somewhere tonight that distance had just collapsed. I did not go looking for Helen Murdoch. She found me. It was a Tuesday, 11 days after the break-in, and the bruise on my left side had faded from purple to a dull yellow that hurt only when I breathed too deeply or laughed, which was not often. I was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing a printed spectrogram of Colton's whispered threat from the night he entered my house, comparing the frequency pattern against his baseline, when my phone rang. The caller identification read a number I did not recognize. Area code 906. Local. The woman on the other end spoke in a voice I would later classify as mezzo-soprano, approximately 190 hertz, with a slight tremor on the vowels that indicated sustained anxiety rather than acute fear. She said her name was Helen Murdoch. She said she had worked as a legal secretary at Ashford, Kessler and Brandt for 3 years, 7 months, and 14 days. She said she had been watching the news. She said she needed to talk to someone who would listen. I told her I was listening. She asked if we could meet somewhere that was not her home, and not my home, and not anywhere near the courthouse. I suggested the parking lot behind the public library on Front Street. She said she would be in a dark green Subaru Forester. I said I would be the man who looked like he had not slept in 2 weeks. She almost laughed. Almost. I arrived 12 minutes early and parked facing the entrance because 28 years of fieldwork teaches you to always watch the door. Helen pulled in at exactly the time she promised. She was perhaps 50. With short silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, she carried a cardboard banker's box with both hands, the kind you use for filing old tax returns or storing things you do not want anyone else to find. She placed the box on the hood of my truck because there was nowhere else to put it, and she looked at me with an expression I have seen many times in interview rooms. It is the expression of a person who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and has finally decided to set it down regardless of what happens next. She told me she had started keeping records on her 7th month at the firm. Not because anyone asked her to, not because she suspected anything specific. She said she started because small things did not add up, and she had been raised by an accountant who taught her that when numbers do not add up, you write them down until they do. The box contained a composition notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover, filled with 3 years of dated entries, written in neat cursive. It contained printed copies of internal emails she had forwarded to a personal account before deleting the forwarding rule. It contained photocopies of expense reports with handwritten annotations in the margins. It contained a manila envelope with 4 photographs of documents she had seen on Colton's desk and photographed with her phone when he stepped out for lunch. I asked her why she had kept all of this for 3 years without telling anyone. She said she had tried once. She said she went to the senior partner, a man named Gerald Kessler, and told him she had concerns about Mr. Ashford's billing practices and client interactions. She said Gerald listened for approximately 90 seconds, thanked her for her diligence, and the following Monday, her desk was moved from the 2nd floor to a windowless office in the basement next to the copier room. She said she understood the message. She said she kept writing anyway. I opened the notebook to a random page. The entry was dated March 14th, 2 years prior. It read, CA left office at 2:15 p.m. Returned at 4:42 p.m. Said he was at a deposition. No deposition scheduled on calendar. Smelled like bourbon. Suit jacket had a small tear on the left cuff that was not there in the morning. Receptionist asked if he was okay. He said fine. He did not look fine. Another entry. 5 months later. Kay instructed me to shred correspondence file for client W. Langston. I shredded the copies. I kept the originals in my home filing cabinet. The surname stopped me. Langston. Phoebe Langston. The woman who had called me 2 weeks earlier. The woman Colton had dated before Wren. The prior victim, whose voice I had heard trembling through a phone line from a dark house on the east side of Marquette. Helen had connected them without knowing she had connected them. Her records showed a pattern. Every relationship Colton maintained followed the same operational structure: initial generosity, gradual isolation, financial restriction, emotional surveillance. And when the person tried to leave, a systematic campaign to discredit them professionally and socially. Phoebe Langston was not an exception. She was a prototype. I asked Helen what she wanted to happen with the box. She said she wanted it to go wherever it needed to go, so that what she had written down for 3 years would mean something. She said she was tired of carrying it. She said the box weighed 11 pounds, but it felt like it weighed everything she had. I drove the box directly to Vivian Cross's office. I placed it on her desk beside the USB drive that was already there. Vivian opened the notebook, read 3 pages, closed it, and removed her glasses. She pressed her fingertips against her closed eyes for several seconds. When she looked up, she said something I will not forget. She said, "Hugh, this is not just a domestic abuse case anymore. This is a pattern of conduct case. And pattern of conduct cases do not end with restraining orders. They end with sentences." I drove home in silence. Wren was sitting on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders, watching the birch trees move in the wind. She asked me where I had been. I told her I had met someone who had been listening even longer than I had. She did not ask anything else. She moved over on the bench to make room for me. And we sat there together watching the trees bend and recover. Bend and recover. The way living things do when the wind will not stop, but they refuse to break. I drove to Phoebe Langston's house on a Thursday morning, when the sky was the color of old steel, and the temperature had climbed just enough above freezing to turn the roads into something between ice and water. Her house was a craftsman bungalow on the east side of Marquette, set back from the street behind 2 birch trees that had lost their leaves months ago. The paint on the front porch was peeling in long strips that curled like paper. The mailbox was full. I knocked 3 times. The interval between each knock was deliberate, evenly spaced, approximately 1.2 seconds apart. I have learned that erratic knocking triggers fear. Measured knocking signals patience. She opened the door on a chain and looked at me through the 4-inch gap, with eyes that reminded me of Wren's eyes on the night she collapsed on my porch. Not the same color. The same distance. The distance a person puts between themselves and the world when they have learned that the world contains someone who will hurt them if they get too close. I told her my name. I told her I was Wren's father. I told her I was not there to ask her to do anything she did not want to do. She closed the door. I heard the chain slide. She opened it again, all the way this time, and stepped aside. The inside of the house was clean but sparse. A couch with a single blanket folded on one arm. A bookshelf with more empty space than books. A kitchen table with 1 chair. Everything in the house said the same thing. One person lives here. One person has lived here alone for a long time. One person has made peace with that. She made coffee in a pour-over that took 4 minutes. Neither of us spoke during those 4 minutes. I listened to the water move through the grounds, and the ceramic cup receive the liquid, and the small sounds her hands made as she set the cup in front of me. Her hands were steady. That told me she had expected someone to come eventually. She sat across from me and said she would tell me what happened, but she would only tell me once. I said, once was enough. Phoebe Langston met Colton Ashford 6 years ago at a fundraiser for the Upper Peninsula Land Conservancy. She was 31. He was 29. He was charming, in a way she described as architectural. Every word was placed. Every gesture was designed. She said falling in love with him was like walking into a building that looked beautiful from every angle until you realized there were no exits. The first year was generous. Trips, gifts, introductions to people she had never had access to. He helped her secure a promotion at the nonprofit where she worked. He spoke about her to his colleagues, as though she were the most remarkable person he had ever met. She said she believed him because no one had ever said those things about her before, and she wanted them to be true. The second year, the doors began to close. He suggested she spend less time with certain friends. He offered to manage their shared expenses because he was better with numbers. He began commenting on what she wore, what she ate, how she spoke in public. He installed a security system in their apartment that he controlled from his phone. He told her it was for her safety. She said she believed that too, because the alternative was too frightening to consider. By the third year, she was not allowed to leave the apartment without telling him where she was going, how long she would be, and who she would see. Her phone was monitored. Her email was forwarded to an account she did not control. When she cried, he recorded it and played it back to her later, telling her she sounded unstable and asking if she thought a reasonable person would behave that way. She left on a night in February. She did not plan it. She simply walked out of the front door while he was in the shower and kept walking until she reached her mother's house 7 blocks away, in bare feet on frozen sidewalks. I heard that detail and felt something tighten in my chest because I had seen my own daughter's bare feet on my own frozen porch, and the distance between these two women was not 6 years. It was nothing. It was the same story told in the same season, with the same cold ground beneath their feet. After she left, Colton filed a defamation complaint against her. He contacted her employer. He told mutual friends she had a substance abuse problem. Her nonprofit terminated her position 4 months later, citing performance concerns that appeared in her file only after Colton made 3 phone calls to the executive director. She showed me a printout of an email from Helen Murdoch's personal account, sent 18 months ago, confirming the calls were logged in the firm's internal contact ledger. I asked her if she would be willing to speak with Vivian Cross. She looked at her coffee for a long time. The surface had stopped moving. She said she had spent 3 years trying to forget Colton Ashford existed. She said every time she heard a man's voice at a certain pitch, she felt her shoulders rise toward her ears. She said she slept with the bathroom light on because complete darkness reminded her of the apartment when he turned off the power to punish her for arguing. Then she said yes. She said yes because she did not want another woman to sit alone in a house with 1 chair and a full mailbox and peeling paint, wondering if the quiet she had finally found was freedom or just the space left behind after someone dismantled her life and walked away without consequence. I thanked her. I did not shake her hand because I did not want to touch her without invitation. She walked me to the door and said one more thing. She said, "He told me once that no one would ever believe me, because I was not the kind of person people listen to." She paused. "Tell your daughter he was wrong." I drove to Vivian's office and told her Phoebe would testify. Vivian closed her notebook and said, "That makes 3 independent sources. Helen's records, the audio, and now a prior victim willing to take the stand." She looked at me across the desk and said, "He is going to try something before the trial. You know that." I said I knew. She said, "Be ready." I said I had been ready since 3 in the morning on a night in January, when my daughter knocked on my door and could not speak. 2 days later, Colton's attorney filed an emergency motion to suppress all audio evidence, claiming it was obtained through unauthorized surveillance in violation of Michigan's 2-party consent law. Vivian had anticipated this. She had filed a preemptive brief, arguing that the recordings were made by equipment installed and owned by Colton himself, on his own property, connected to his own cloud account, and that no third party had installed or activated any recording device. The person who built the cage had also built the key that opened it. She told me the hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. That weekend, I did not sleep well. I sat in the kitchen with the lights off and listened to the house. The baseboard heater clicked every 35 minutes. The refrigerator hummed at 60 hertz. Wren was asleep in the guest room, and her breathing was steady and deep, the kind of breathing that belongs to someone who has finally stopped running. I listened to that sound for a long time. It was the only frequency I needed. The Marquette County Courthouse is a building made of sandstone and silence. I have been inside courtrooms in 14 states and 3 foreign countries during my career with the Bureau. I have testified in cases involving kidnapping, fraud, extortion, and murder. I have sat in witness chairs bolted to floors that were older than my grandparents. But I had never walked into a courtroom where my daughter's name was on the docket and my own voice was part of the evidence. That changes everything. That changes the way your shoes sound on the marble. That changes the weight of the door when you push it open. That changes the temperature of the air inside your lungs. The bench trial began on a Monday at 9:15 in the morning, before Judge Victoria Ames. She was approximately 60 years old with short gray hair and glasses she wore on a chain around her neck and put on only when reading documents. She spoke in a voice that measured approximately 160 hertz, low for a woman, steady, with no upward inflection at the end of her sentences. That told me she was not asking. She was telling. I respected her immediately. The courtroom was not full. Bench trials do not attract crowds the way jury trials do. There were no cameras because Judge Ames had denied all media requests. The gallery contained Sandra Kowalski from Adult Protective Services, Officer Tanya Birch in civilian clothes, Dr. Einar Lindgren sitting near the back with a manila folder on his lap, and Helen Murdoch in the third row wearing a gray cardigan and holding nothing because everything she had carried for 3 years was already in evidence. Wren sat behind the prosecution table beside me. She wore a dark blue blouse, and her hair was pulled back, and her hands were folded in her lap. She did not look at Colton. I watched her breathing. It was controlled. Approximately 14 breaths per minute. Slightly elevated, but disciplined. She had practiced this. She had sat on the porch for 3 evenings in a row, breathing with the rhythm of the wind through the birch trees, until her body learned to hold steady even when every signal in her nervous system was telling her to run. Colton sat at the defense table in a navy suit with a white shirt and no tie. His attorney was a man named Richard Daly from a firm in Lansing, retained specifically for this case. Colton's posture was upright, shoulders back, chin level. His breathing was diaphragmatic. His hands were still. He looked like a man who had rehearsed calm the way actors rehearse grief, from the outside in, perfecting the shape of the thing without ever touching the substance. Vivian Cross stood and delivered her opening statement in a voice that was clear and unadorned. She did not raise her volume. She did not gesture. She said this was a case about a man who installed microphones in his own home to monitor and control his wife. She said the evidence would show a pattern of coercive control spanning multiple relationships and multiple years. She said the people of the state of Michigan would present audio recordings made by the defendant's own equipment, a 3-year contemporaneous log maintained by a witness inside the defendant's own law firm, testimony from a prior victim who endured an identical pattern of abuse, medical records documenting injuries, consistent with repeated physical violence, and an Adult Protective Services report substantiating domestic abuse and recommending criminal prosecution. She said all of this in under 4 minutes. She sat down. Richard Daly stood and spoke for 11 minutes. He used words like misunderstanding, troubled history, estranged father, and mental health challenges. He suggested that Hugh Callister was a retired federal agent with a history of obsessive surveillance behavior who had manipulated evidence to frame his son-in-law. He called Phoebe Langston a disgruntled former partner. He called Helen Murdoch a terminated employee with a personal vendetta. He called the audio recordings illegally obtained and forensically unreliable. He did not raise his voice either, but his pitch shifted upward by approximately 9 hertz over the course of his statement, which told me he did not fully believe what he was saying. I was called as the first witness. Vivian asked me to state my name, my former occupation, and my qualifications. I said my name was Hugh Callister. I said I had served 28 years as a forensic audio analyst with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I said I had provided expert testimony in 247 federal cases. I said 38 of those cases resulted in convictions based primarily or substantially on audio evidence I had analyzed. I said I held certifications in acoustic forensics, spectrographic voice identification, and digital signal processing from 3 accredited institutions. Vivian asked me to describe the night of January 7th. I described the knock at 3:02 in the morning. I described opening the door and finding my daughter on the porch, barefoot, blue-lipped, hypothermic, wearing a pearl-colored silk blouse in a blizzard at -18 degrees Fahrenheit. I described carrying her inside and wrapping her in wool blankets. I described the bruises I found on her wrists and upper arms, layered in different stages of healing, some purple, some green, some yellow. A calendar of pain written on her skin. Vivian asked me to describe the discovery of the microphones. I described visiting Colton's home in July to repair a kitchen pipe and hearing a 14,200 Hz tone from an electrical outlet. I described identifying it as an active condenser microphone. I described finding 3 microphones that day and learning later from the APS investigation that Colton had added 8 more, bringing the total to 11 devices placed throughout the house. Vivian asked me to describe the audio evidence. I said I had obtained over 400 hours of recordings from a cloud storage account maintained and paid for by the defendant, captured by microphones purchased, installed, and operated by the defendant, on property owned by the defendant. I said I did not install any equipment. I did not activate any equipment. I accessed recordings that already existed on a server the defendant controlled. Richard Daly objected. He said the access was unauthorized. Judge Ames looked at him over her glasses and said she had already ruled on the suppression motion and denied it. She told him to sit down. He sat down. His breathing shifted from diaphragmatic to thoracic. That told me he understood the case had just changed direction. Vivian asked me to describe what the recordings contained. I began with the entry dated August 19th. I opened my mouth, and for the first time in 28 years of testimony, my voice hesitated. Not because I was uncertain. Not because I had forgotten. Because the recording I was about to describe was my daughter begging, and no amount of professional distance prepares you for the sound of your own child saying, "I understand," to a man who has taken everything from her and is asking if she knows it. I steadied myself. I looked at Wren. She nodded once. I began. I pressed play. The courtroom heard what I had heard alone in my kitchen at 2 a.m, with headphones on and my hands gripping the table edge. Hearing it alone is one thing. Hearing it in a room full of people required by law to listen is something else. The recording dated August 19th filled the courtroom the way cold air fills a house when someone leaves the front door open in winter. Colton's voice came through the speaker at 115 Hz, flat, controlled, stripped of affect. "You will not call anyone. You will not text anyone. You will not leave this house without my permission. Do you understand? No upward inflection." The spectrogram showed a perfectly level pitch contour, the vocal signature of a person who has given this instruction before and expects compliance the way gravity expects objects to fall. Then Wren's voice. "I understand." 2 words. Her fundamental frequency had dropped to 171 Hz, 18 below her normal range. Her amplitude was reduced by approximately 40%. The harmonic overtones that give a human voice its warmth were almost entirely absent. She sounded like a person reading words off a wall in a language she no longer believed in. I played the second recording, dated October 14th. Colton on the phone, laughing once. I handled it before with the last one. Different girl. Same approach. You control the money first, then the phone, then the friends. After that, they do not have anywhere to go. His voice matched his baseline at 99.7%. The spectrographic overlay showed 2 waveforms lying almost perfectly on top of each other. Richard Daly objected. He said the recordings had been manipulated. Judge Ames asked if he had an expert to support that claim. He did not. She overruled the objection. Vivian called Phoebe Langston. Phoebe walked to the witness chair in 12 steps and sat with her fingertips pressing white against the armrest. She described the pattern: generosity, isolation, financial control, emotional surveillance, recording her crying and playing it back. She said she left on a night in February, barefoot on frozen sidewalks, and walked 7 blocks to her mother's house. When she finished, the courtroom was silent for 6 seconds. I counted. 6 seconds in a courtroom is enormous. long enough for everyone to understand that what they heard is not an allegation but a blueprint. And the man who drew it is sitting 15 feet away, pretending to breathe normally. Helen Murdoch took the stand carrying nothing because everything she documented was already entered as Exhibits 14 through 31. She described 3 years of record-keeping, Gerald Kessler moving her desk to the basement, the shredding order for Phoebe's file, and photographing documents on Colton's desk during lunch breaks. Richard Daly cross-examined for 9 minutes. He asked if she had a personal grievance. She said her only grievance was that she waited 3 years to speak. He asked if she was compensated. She said the only thing she received was the ability to sleep without the box under her bed. Dr. Lindgren confirmed the shoulder bruise was approximately 14 days old, consistent with a gripping hand spanning 8 inches. He confirmed Wren's core temperature upon arrival was 91.4 degrees. Officer Birch confirmed the initial report and Wren's statement about the $30 limit and monitored phone. Sandra Kowalski confirmed the 8-page APS report. 11 microphones, locked medication, restricted account, and bedroom security bar. Vivian rested the people's case. Daly called no witnesses. His closing lasted 8 minutes. He repeated misunderstanding and context. His pitch averaged 124 hertz, 9 above his opening. His micro-pauses had doubled. He was filling time. Judge Ames recessed for 47 minutes. Wren and I sat in the gallery without speaking. The ventilation hummed at 58 hertz. A shoe squeaked on marble in the hallway. A door closed on the second floor. These are the sounds a building makes when it is holding its breath. Judge Ames returned and read from a 6-page opinion. Guilty on all charges. Coercive control, constituting domestic abuse, under Michigan compiled laws. Section 750.81. Unlawful surveillance. Witness intimidation. Home invasion. She found the pattern of conduct evidence compelling and the recordings authentic. She noted the defendant constructed a system of control using technology, financial restriction, and psychological manipulation applied to more than one victim over 6 years. She sentenced Colton Ashford to 9 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections. She issued a lifetime personal protection order for Wren and Phoebe. She recommended the state bar review his license. Colton did not move. His breathing remained diaphragmatic. His face showed nothing, but his right hand on the defense table trembled once. A single involuntary micro-tremor lasting less than half a second. No one else saw it. I saw it. 28 years taught me where to look. It is never the face. It is always the hands. The bailiff led him toward the side door. As he passed, he looked at me. Not at Wren. At me. His eyes held the frequency beneath the frequency. The sound a man makes when he realizes the tools he built to control someone became the instruments of his own conviction. The latch closed behind him at approximately 2,000 hertz. Metallic. Final. Clean. Wren and I walked into the corridor. The marble stretched ahead, long and empty. Lit by fluorescence, buzzing at 120 hertz. She stopped halfway. She turned to me. Her eyes were wet, but her breathing was steady. 12 breaths per minute. The calmest since January. She said, "Thank you for hearing me," I said. I never stopped listening. We walked the rest of the corridor together. Our footsteps falling into the same rhythm the way two instruments find the same tempo when they have played long enough to trust each other. The courthouse door opened onto a March afternoon where the sun was out for the first time in 11 days and the light turned the sandstone, the color of warm honey, and the air was 38 degrees and rising. 3 months after the trial, Wren and I moved into a house on the eastern shore of Lake Superior, 11 miles north of Marquette. It was a small house. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with a window that faced the water, and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides like arms holding the structure together. The previous owner had been a retired music teacher who died at 87, and when I first walked through the front door, I understood why she had chosen this place. Every room had sound. The lake pushed waves against the rocky shore at a rhythm of approximately 7 seconds between crests. The wind moved through a stand of white pines on the north side of the property at a frequency that shifted between 400 and 600 hertz depending on the season. The floorboards were old maple, and they spoke beneath your feet with every step. Not complaining, just acknowledging that someone was there. Ren chose the bedroom facing east because she said she wanted the sunrise to be the first thing she saw every morning. I took the bedroom facing the lake because I have spent my entire adult life listening to things in the dark, and the lake at night makes a sound that is neither silence nor noise, but something between the two, something that holds you the way a hand holds a sleeping child's shoulder. Present without pressing. She reopened her speech-language pathology practice in April. She rented a small office above a bookstore on Washington Street in downtown Marquette. She started with 3 clients. By June, she had 11. She specialized in adults who had lost their voices, not physically but psychologically. People who had been told for so long that their words did not matter that they had stopped producing them. She understood this condition from the inside. She had lived it. She once told me that the hardest part of therapy is not teaching someone to speak again, but convincing them that the room they are speaking into is safe enough to hold what they have to say. I watched her heal the way you watch a birch tree recover after a storm. Not all at once. Not in a straight line. Some mornings she woke up and made coffee and sat on the porch and talked to me about her clients and the lake and the way the light changed color when it passed through the pine needles. Other mornings she woke up and said nothing and sat on the same porch and looked at the same lake, and I knew that she was somewhere I could not reach, somewhere back in a house with 11 microphones and a locked medicine cabinet, and a man who measured her silence the way I measured sound. On those mornings I sat beside her and said nothing, and let the silence be what it needed to be. I have learned that silence between two people who trust each other is not empty. It is full. It is the frequency of safety. Phoebe Langston called in May. She said she had applied for a position at the Land Conservancy where she had worked before Colton dismantled her career. She said they offered her the job. She said she cried in her car in the parking lot for 12 minutes before driving home. She asked if she could visit sometime. Ren said yes. They sat on the porch together for an entire afternoon, and I stayed inside and listened to the sound of 2 women laughing for the first time in years, a sound that registered in no spectrogram and required no forensic analysis because some frequencies are not meant to be measured, they are meant to be felt. Helen Murdoch sent a letter in June. Handwritten. She said she had started a new job at a legal aid clinic in Escanaba. She said the clinic served domestic violence survivors who could not afford representation. She said she kept a composition notebook on her desk, the same kind with the black and white marbled cover. But this time she was writing down things that were going right. I sold my forensic audio equipment. I sold my Jeep. I spent $23,500 to protect my daughter. I would spend it again. I would spend everything again. The equipment can be replaced. The Jeep cannot, because Margaret named it. And Margaret is gone. And some things that carry the dead forward cannot be bought back. But my daughter is alive. My daughter is sitting on a porch 11 miles north of Marquette, watching the sun come up over Lake Superior, with a blanket around her shoulders and a cup of coffee in her hands, and a voice that is coming back, one word at a time, one client at a time, one morning at a time. On a Tuesday evening in June, Ren came home from her office carrying a small box wrapped in brown paper. She placed it on the kitchen table and said, "Open it." Inside was a pair of professional monitoring headphones, the kind I had used for 28 years at the Bureau, high fidelity, circumaural, with a frequency response flat from 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz. On the inside of the left ear cup she had engraved 5 words in small silver letters. "You heard me when no one else could." I put them on. I did not play anything. I sat at the kitchen table wearing those headphones and listened to the house, the lake against the shore, the wind in the pines, the maple floor settling beneath the weight of evening, Ren washing dishes in the next room, humming a melody I recognized from her childhood, something Margaret used to sing when she thought no one was listening. I closed my eyes. The house was full of sound. Every room held a frequency. Every frequency held a person. And every person held a story that deserved to be heard. Margaret once told me, "Protect what makes sound in this house. The silence is what kills." I failed to understand what she meant until the night my daughter knocked on my door at 3 in the morning and could not speak. Now I understand. Sound is not just vibration. Sound is proof of life. And listening is not just a skill. It is the deepest form of love I know. If you are watching this right now, let me ask you something. Not as a former agent, not as an analyst, as a father. Is someone in your life going quiet? Not the kind of quiet that means peace. The kind that means surrender. Because I almost missed it. I almost missed the most important sound of my life. And it came as a knock on a frozen door at 3 in the morning from a woman who had walked 2 miles through a blizzard in bare feet because she had nowhere else to go. Listen. Before the silence becomes permanent. Listen.